online news said hi for the high hotels all around the world. I'm Robin Stienberg, and today we have a very special guest who's none other than Mr. Asad ul Ibal Latif. He's actually a researcher here at ISIS, and he's a visiting research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies. His areas of research include Singapore's political and strategic relations with China, India, and the United States. He's also the author of 4 books, including Lincoln Sun, a builder of Singapore. He graduated with honors in English from Presidency College, Calcutta, and received his Master's of Letters degree in History of Clare Hall, Cambridge, where he was Raffles, and also the S. Rajaratnam Scholar. He was also a Fulbright visiting scholar at Harvard University's Whitehead Center for International Affairs. And he has also been a journalist for 25 years before joining ISIS. And he was also a Jefferson Fellow at the East-West Center in Hawaii. And today we're going to talk about a little bit about his work and also his previous published work called Wang, Gungwu, Ginger Scholar and Gentleman. And it was a conversation with a very well-known scholar here in Singapore. Mr. Asad, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
It's a marvel to see how much effort and work you put into, especially this book, based on the great historian here in Southeast Asia, Mr. Wang. Now, what actually drove the inspiration to write biographies of such people?
Thank you, Robin. Well, thank you very much for joining us on this show. Professor Wang Gungwu is what I would call, and many other people would call, a truly Renaissance man. Not just a Renaissance scholar, but a truly Renaissance man, because in his spirit, in his morality, in his modesty, in his equanimity, he has gathered together a certain approach to life, not just to history, but to life, which reminds one of the great Renaissance scholars and men. What drove me was to try and capture, especially for a younger generation, the essence of his thinking. But that is very difficult because Professor Wang is a mammoth historian, a gargantuan intellectual, and an inexhaustible human being. So how does one try to glimpse that person through a book like this? So my hope was to try and capture some of the main strands of his thinking in terms of chapters and weave into his thinking an account of his life. So it was very simple. We had interviews, I think over 12 sessions, about 1 hour each. After that I edited the interviews and made them manageable, put them into a book of this size, and there is a very substantial bibliography of his works here. So my hope has been to capture, if that's the right word, because I don't think it can really be captured, to try and give a sense of what makes Professor Wang Gungwu Professor Wang Gungwu.
Now, is there one particular chapter, or maybe 2, if you could recommend, that actually appeal to you the most and actually expound and inspire you?
True. I think the account of his early life in Malaya and then Malaysia was interesting because it brought to the fore some of the crucial questions of nationalism, multiracialism, multiculturalism in certain ways that I think Southeast Asia is still grappling with. The other chapter that really, kind of woke me up from whatever little slumber I might have, had in my life was his account of how he sees ancient China, or the sense of this history in China influencing Chinese foreign policy today. Because this, of course, he is first and foremost an historian of classical China. He's also, of course, a great historian of Southeast Asia. But in this chapter, what appealed to me was his contention that if the Chinese follow their own history and not the history of the Western colonial powers who came into Asia in the 16th century and who changed the landscape, so to say. So if the Chinese remain true to their own history, rather than copy the imperialism of the European powers in Asia, then there will be no reason to suspect Chinese hegemony in the future, because there was no Chinese hegemony of the colonial sort in the past. But if the Chinese want to be another Western power, this time in Asia, then there would be problems, because they would be behaving like the European powers. So this, I thought, was an encapsulation of something that is very, very important to us in this part of the world, and I think elsewhere as well, because everybody wants China to be a stakeholder power. But China will be a stakeholder only on its own terms. And so long as those terms are roughly and largely historical, there is nothing to fear from the rise of China.
Now, speaking about the rise of China, you've done a good number of research on these issues, and especially relations with the United States. What's your perception today between China, India, and the US, and what does it mean for Southeast Asia?
Thank you, Robin. I think the relationship between the United States and China is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. It's as simple as that. It is not a G2 relationship, a group of two. It's not. It includes everybody else. But so long as relations between the United States and China remain on even keel, others will not be forced to choose sides between the two. There would be a bit of hedging here, hedging there, sometimes a little close to China, sometimes a little close to the United States, militarily close to the United States, but economically close to China. All that is possible, all that is very normal in the world. What no one in Southeast Asia wants to have to do is to choose sides. And I think this is where India comes in as well. If you look at Southeast Asia, it's a very interesting concept. Southeast Asia is south of China, east of India. That's how it gets its geographical parameters. The name goes back to the 1940s and so on. That's different. But this is what Southeast Asia is. It is essentially a buffer region between China and India. If the Sino-American relationship is good, there is no containment of China. There is no attempt to push China into a corner. Then it's all right. But if that occurs, India will be drawn in. Southeast Asia would be torn between China and India, both of which are rising Asian powers, both of which are nuclear armed, both of which are the powers of the future. And this is where the American role becomes very important. Those who want America to go into decline, because America is seen as an imperial power in many ways, do not perhaps realize what that would mean for Asia. Because if you take, the Americans out of the equation, then I'm not saying that China and India and China and Japan and Korea will go to war tomorrow. That won't happen. They're not stupid people, of course. But what could very well happen is that the balance for power would go up, that the struggle for influence would go up in such a way that the smaller powers of Asia, including all the countries of ASEAN, which are actually small compared to in influence, in size and influence, in economic scope compared to China and India, would have tremendous problems. So the bottom line is, I think we don't want an overbearing America. Who would? But we don't want America to go into the kind of decline that makes it retrench its forward deployment here, whether militarily, the economic interests that the United States has in Southeast Asia and vice versa. We don't want America to decline to the point where China, India, Japan, Korea, and whoever else would be forced to create a new balance of power. So I think that is why I believe, and I think the Americans realize this, I think the Chinese realize this. The Chinese perhaps don't really want the Americans to be out of this region as well. They don't want the Americans to, as they see it, contain them by, through these relationships with Japan and Korea, which are, treaty relationships. Then the relationship with India, which is a very powerful one. The Chinese don't want to be contained by anyone. Again, who would? But the Chinese don't want the Americans to just depart and leave the strategic playing field open for others to come in. So I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think here in Southeast Asia, we ASEAN, I would say, both as a grouping and as in terms of its member states, we are it's very clear about what is at stake. It is the future of peace, prosperity, stability, security, prosperity in this region. So the American, to get to the point, I think the Americans are welcome here. They are welcome in their economic presence, through their economic presence. They're welcome in terms of the balancing role that they play between China and Japan, for one thing. And I think the people want them to be here. But the truth is that China is rising, India is rising. It is not that the Americans are going into decline. It is relative. And relative, that is only natural. As somebody else comes up, and unless you keep up going all the way, there will be relative decline. But it doesn't mean that the Americans are out of the game. I don't think anyone wants the Americans to be out of the game. But the Chinese, like the Indians, like the Indonesians, like everybody else, they want to have a certain autonomy in terms of their foreign policy. And that is perfectly understandable. They don't have to agree with the Americans, on everything. The Americans don't agree with the Europeans on everything. The Europeans don't agree with the Americans on everything. Mm-hmm. We saw that in the lead up to the Iraq War. So I think for Asia, I think, thank you for asking that question, Robin. I think, the way forward is to have all the major powers in and hope that they will keep the peace among themselves so that the peace exists for the rest of us as well.
Now, how does one see peace when we have an emerging currency crisis right now around the world? How does the U.S., especially the European crisis, and now China is going to get involved with all these investments and buyouts? How does Southeast Asia look at it? Do you see or foresee probably an international currency, probably the yen? What is your take on this?
I don't think the yen. I think particularly after the experience of the eurozone and of the euro, basically, I don't think anyone is going to think of a regional currency anywhere in any part of the world. That is a transnational currency. I just don't see that happening. And then, of course, if Asia were to have an international currency, a regional currency, would it be the yuan? Would it be the yen? Which is more internationalized, which can afford to be more internationalized, the yen, I suppose. But I don't think it will ever come to that point because, and this I think is very, very important, we have to learn from the Europeans. The wonderful things they've done with the European Union, which I think is the most wonderful international project on offer today. But the way the Eurozone was created shows that unless you have political integration, you cannot have economic integration. Because different fiscal policies will be followed, different countries will have different ways of drawing up policies, and then you have a common currency. You can't not have some kind of common common financial and political planning. No, that's not there in Asia, will not be there for many, many years to come. Even ASEAN is far away from that. So I think the lessons for us here, whether it's Americans or whether it's Europeans, is that international competitiveness has, countries and regions go through ups and downs, and the Americans will come up again because their investment in research and development, the entrepreneurial spirit that they have, which is true of the Europeans as well. These things will not be kept down for long. The Americans will come up again. The Europeans will come through this crisis, I think, stronger in certain ways. I really hope that Greece is not forced to leave the Eurozone because that would be a slap in the face of this whole historical project called the European Union. But I think, therefore, for us in Asia, we have to be, the lesson for us is to be cautious and never to think of economic integration without concomitant political integration.
Amazing. And speaking about integration, please do not forget to get hold of this book written by Mr. Asad Ibn Latif, Wang Gungwu, Zunzi scholar and gentleman. It gives you a lot of insights by this great historian, and even about issues on Southeast Asia and some parts of the future even. How does Professor Wang looks at the relationship with the US and India today?
Well, we went a little into that. I think Professor Wang is very conscious as an historian that great powers like China, actually great civilizations like China and India, will not play by others' rules very long. He doesn't put it so bluntly, but that's the sense I got from what he said. And therefore, the importance of his hoping that the Chinese would remain true to their own history and not try to emulate the European colonial powers who came into Asia. India too has an important role to play. It's a large country. It's a linchpin. It's the linchpin of South Asia. We can't imagine South Asia without India, just as we can't imagine Northeast Asia. Sorry, we cannot imagine South Asia without India, just as we cannot imagine Northeast Asia without China. And I think as an historian and a scholar of Southeast Asia, Professor Wang is very conscious of the fact that smaller countries in this region will have to understand what makes these great powers behave in the way they do. And I think his hope, if I again might summarize this, is for the Americans to play a constructive role. Obviously, there will be a balance of power between the Americans and the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans, and the other way around. But to keep this within the parameters of peace, stability, and prosperity, because actually, at the end of the day, everybody benefits from this status quo. The Americans benefit, the Europeans benefit. We haven't spoken about the Europeans, but they do benefit. The Chinese benefit, the Indians benefit, and ASEAN benefits. In other words, the status quo, nothing remains the same, but if the broad parameters of the status quo continue to exist, they will be good for the world as a whole. Because we cannot forget, and let me end on this note, we cannot forget that the economic center of international gravity, or rather the center of international economic gravity is moving towards the east. But let's not be confident that this will happen just like that, because if there is conflict in this part of the world, then the economic hopes will just completely be dashed.
Mr. Latif, can you give us 3 points about your life's work and your inspiration behind all of these wonderful books that you have written, biographies, and it's deeply detailed and well researched. Please look up for this book at ISIS Publishing, and it really is wonderful. You can check it out at www.bookshop.isis.edu.sg. Give us 3 points about behind your inspiration and your life's work. How does one, able to, to find such insights, and passion?
It's very kind of you to put it in those terms. I'll be more modest. I'll say that this is what is expected of me because I'm paid as I'm a researcher. I'm supposed to do research. But thank you again for that question. 3 points. One, I think, to me, the sense of history is very important, because if we don't have a sense of how we became what we are, we will never have a sense of how we want to be what we want to be. So this sense of history is very important. That's why Professor Wang Gungwu's work is so important to me. My second guiding principle is a sense of the word literature, because I think a lot of things many things are said best when they can be said as beautifully, cogently as possible. And this is where again Professor Wang's way of speaking, he speaks like others write. Everything is structured, the grammar is perfect, the intonation is perfect, and it was an inspiration. But of course, my other book on Mr. Lim Kim San, who was responsible for public housing in Singapore, former cabinet minister, called Mr. Housing, and as you might know, Singapore's public housing is one of the jewels of this country's many achievements. I would probably say the main achievement, because the fact that we have this level, this quality of public housing is quite unimaginable. That was a bit different. So that was that would be my third point. Action. So I think one was history, the other would be literature, language, strength of language, and the third is action, in terms of a certain commitment to doing things that will outlast oneself. Here again, as a journalist in India, in Hong Kong, and in Singapore, it was my privilege and pleasure to have met many people who have contributed in big and small ways, and who very often will remain anonymous. They've not been known. So I've tried to put it all together in my work as a researcher, and I've tried to do these little books which will at least, and my hope is that younger generations down the road will look at them and say, oh, these people tried so hard, so there is something to build on. Because at the end of the day, we will have to go, but what we leave behind, now I don't think this would be my legacy, it's in a small way Professor Wang's legacy, a part of his legacy, to say that, we are leaving behind for you, young, in Singaporeans or Malaysians or Chinese or Americans or Indians, something for you to build on. Do not give up hope.
Well, thank you so much. Well said. And thank you for joining me with Mr. Latif from ISIS, who shares his insights on Southeast Asia and the relationship with the United States and India, as well as China. I'm Robin Steinberg, Senate Hyatt for the National Critics' Choice. Thank you.